Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome all of you to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dori Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement and your host for this series. So now I want to get right to the meat of the interview and tell you a little about our special guest for today, Mark Miller. Mark is a journalist, author, and podcaster who's a nationally recognized expert on trends in retirement and aging. His writing offers a holistic view of retirement security, including healthcare and Medicare, Social Security, retirement investing, midlife careers, and housing. He also writes frequently about retirement-related public policy issues, including reform of Social Security, Medicare, and workplace retirement plans. His work appears in Reuters, New York Times, Morningstar, and wealthmanagement.com. And he also publishes a free Substack newsletter and a podcast on retirement. His latest book, which is the focus of today, is Retirement Reboot, Commonsense Strategies for Getting Back on Track. He's the former editor of Crain's Chicago Business and the Sunday editor of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mark really has been, he's a prolific writer, and the way that we're going to be structuring it today, I want to start out and I want Mark to just tell us a little about what prompted him to write the book, and then he is going to present much of what's in the book, and I want to comment that I recommend this book to people. It is the nuts and bolts of so many things to think about in terms of finances, Social Security, Medicare. It also includes issues about purpose and all of that too, so we'll get to all of that. Mark, why don't we start with you telling the listeners what prompted you to write this, and then we'll let you move on with your presentation, and then we'll integrate the questions at the end.
Dori, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. And before I answer your question, congratulations on the anniversary. It's really phenomenal that you've been doing this now for, more than a decade, it sounds like. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's 10 years of great information for people, so kudos to you. Why did I write the book? This is my third book, and so I've been at this long enough to know that doing a book is a lot of work. And I really felt like if I was going to do a third book, I wanted it to be something I felt really passionately about. And the thing I feel really passionately about on the retirement landscape is that we have a system that is leaving far too many Americans unprepared financially for retirement as they get close to it. And I define close as within a 10-year-ish window. Typically, it's people in their mid-50s and beyond. I've found that's when people really start to actively focus and think about retirement more. And the data tell us that there's just far too many of us who have, for one reason or another, not been able to save very much for retirement. I'll get into that more in the presentation, but I wanted to write a book that would offer practical help and strategies for people who find themselves in that situation on how you could still, even relatively late in the game, improve retirement outcomes. Having said that, I think that a lot of the chapters of the book, many of the chapters should have pretty broad appeal, frankly, up and down the scale of wealth and income, because there are things in here, detailed chapters on things like Social Security optimization and navigating Medicare, just for example, that I think are useful for everybody. And my reporting tells me that there's a real gap in knowledge and understanding about these critical programs.
Great. That gives us, and I think it gives the listeners an idea of what's behind this. Well, why don't I turn it over to you now, and then we'll do questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good. Moving ahead here. Some of this is covering a little bit of what we just discussed, just a little bit of introductions and background about me. I've been covering retirement now for about 15 years. I write for the New York Times and Reuters and Morningstar and Wealth Management. My earlier books are The Hard Times Guide to Retirement Security, which was published in 2010, The Teeth of the Great Recession. That book is actually out of print now at my instruction because it's frankly out of date. It's too old to be of use. Things change as you go along. And I published a book in 2018 that was a little bit of off the beaten path for me. It was called Jolt, Stories of Trauma and Transformation, which was a kind of an outgrowth of the work I do on retirement, having run across lots of fascinating and inspiring stories of people who had transformed their lives at midlife and beyond, often as a result of traumatic events in their life. So that's more of a storytelling book, and that's still around.
And I do want to just interrupt for 1 minute and comment that actually you were a guest before and focused on that book, and it's part of the podcast series. So just
excellent.
So people to know that.
So one of the questions I get is what qualifies me to write this book? And as part of the preparation for this, I said, let me just say that one of the things that's really great about being a journalist is that you get paid to have other smart people teach you things. And so when you're a journalist, you're interviewing people, you're sitting at the feet of people who really know things in great detail about different topics. And if you're good at your job, you figure out who the smart people are and who to go to talk to. And I calculated for the introduction of this book that over this 15 years, I've done over 1,000 stories and columns and podcasts, and have interviewed more than 3,000 people about various retirement topics. So the question in my mind was, gee, what have I learned here that might be worth getting down on paper? And at the same time, I also have a conviction that most personal finance books actually have it upside down. They're actually written for the people who least need the help. I think many people in the personal finance press corps think about personal finance as being the same as investing. And that's incorrect. Personal finance is about so much more than saving and investing. It's about having a plan for retirement. It's about managing your debt. It's about managing your career. It's about housing. It's about so many things, healthcare, health insurance. And at the same time, the data tell us that the stock market is really relevant for maybe a third of people, a third of retirees. We see that the other 2/3 are going to struggle. They're going to experience what many have called the retirement crisis. It's not a phrase I particularly love. But here's the statistic for those who are on the internet, and I hope most of you are, because you're going to see some interesting charts and data here, that I think capsulizes this. This is from a data series called the Elder Index, which is done at the University of Massachusetts, and just aims to measure the ability of people over age 65 to meet their basic living expenses in retirement. Nothing fancy here. We're just talking about shelter, pay the utilities, food on the table, transportation, and the like. And what they find is that well over half of people over age 65 are struggling to meet their basic needs. And the figures are actually a lot worse than that for women and for people of color. The figures are a bit better than that for married couples. There's a number of advantages for people who are married from a sort of a household finance standpoint. But that's a troubling figure that half of people over 65 are struggling, who live alone are struggling. This is a number that really I find concerning. Poverty rates among people over 65 have really plunged over the last 3 or 4 decades, mainly as a result of Social Security and Medicare. And that's really an important public policy achievement in our country. But we saw last year that poverty rates among the 65-plus population actually ticked upward, even as it was falling for all other groups. Now, this may turn out to be an anomalous development related to various things going on related to COVID. I think it's too early to say, but nonetheless, that is a concerning development. We don't want to see poverty rates ticking up among any group, and it's especially so for seniors. Other things are on the horizon from an economic standpoint that I consider troubling. One is, of course, inflation is a major worry right now in a way that it really had not been for at least the last decade, especially healthcare costs, which continue to escalate. We also, I think, are living in a period of really rapid economic change and disruption that creates a great deal of risk for older workers who are nearing retirement. There's so much change going on in the economy that the whole question of how long you'll be able to work before you transition to retirement, there's risk involved there. When we think about how long you'll be able to receive wage income and how long you'll be able to invest. Certainly from an inflation standpoint, we just had this historic 8.7% cost of living adjustment in Social Security, which for this year, which I think will do a good job of keeping most retirees even with the rise in inflation, more or less. I would put an asterisk on that. But certainly that's extremely helpful. And the cost of living adjustment in Social Security is a really critical feature of Social Security. When we look at the broader economic picture for older households, I think there's a number of other important troubling statistics to consider. We've seen traditional defined benefit pensions mostly phased out among private sector employers. They're still very predominant in public sector jobs, but that was really something that has shifted the responsibility for preparing for retirement to individuals and away from the employer, and it's removed a really important source of guaranteed lifetime incomes. Now, most people who are working in the private sector are responsible for saving and investing and figuring out how they can stretch that money throughout retirement on their own. And we see that the median amounts that are saved in 401ks and IRAs for people who are older than 55 is not really all that high. The median figure is about $140,000, but it was just not a great deal when you think about how long that needs to stretch through retirement. But even more troubling, the median numbers mask what's really going on underneath the hood there, because when you look at it broken out by income quartiles, what we see is that most of the saving is concentrated in the highest income quartile. And when you go down to the other three, the amounts that are saved are really frighteningly low, generally speaking, well below $100,000. So a big part of the population hasn't really saved for retirement, hasn't been able to for a variety of reasons. One of which is that only about half of workers have access to or can participate in a workplace retirement plan. For this book, I'm really trying to boil it down to simple terms, and really what is the basic measure of successful retirement is a question that I'm asking. And the basic answer is, how much of your pre-retirement income will you be able to replace? In other words, can you maintain your standard of living in retirement? Financial planners often say that kind of the basic rule of thumb is that you'll need to replace 70% of pre-retirement income. I think that figure sometimes is overstated, and I think it's a highly personal number. But just as a gross rule of thumb, it's not a terrible place to start. I think, and I get into this in the book, there are ways to change that number if you can make adjustments in what you spend, certainly. But if we just start with this sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation of 70% as a rule of thumb for income replacement, we know that Social Security replaces on average about 40%. There's obviously a gap there, and even more troubling, those replacement rates are actually falling. Somebody who retired at 65 in 1995 could expect to receive about 41% replacement rate. That same person, if that person was retiring in 2035, will receive only 29%, and the figure was 36% in 2015. And that has to do with the reforms to Social Security that were made the last time the program was reformed in 1983, with this sort of very gradual, slow increase in what's called the full retirement age, which is the age at which you can receive the full amount of your benefit that you've earned. 100% of your benefit is the full retirement age. And that has gradually moved up from 65. It's headed towards 67. Anybody born after 1960, full retirement age will be 67. And that is, oftentimes when people talk about higher age of retirement for Social Security, it's not well understood that is a benefit cut. It tends to get couched as we're all living longer, so therefore we should boost the retirement age. A couple problems there. One is that, A, we're not all living longer. The gains in longevity in the United States have not been evenly distributed. They've tended to go to more affluent, better educated households. That's one problem, so we're making people wait to get their benefit. But the main reason here that it's problematic is that raising the retirement age essentially raises the bar as to what you have to do to get a full benefit. It is equal to a benefit cut. And in fact, if it weren't equal to a benefit cut, it wouldn't have been done in 1983. It was done as a way to help repair the program's finances. But back to my main point is just to say that Social Security is replacing 40% on average, and for people coming up who are, let's say, Gen X, millennials, they're going to see lower replacement rates than boomers and the silent generation. in sum here, about a third of households, I think, are going to do just fine in retirement. They've been able to save. They're going to receive Social Security. They're likely receiving relatively higher Social Security benefits. So this is the book I wanted to write for everybody else, people who are clearly going to have challenges meeting their basic needs. And that calculation doesn't even take into account kind of the large shocks that can come along in retirement, such as an illness or before retirement, an unexpected job loss, natural disaster, need for an extensive, intensive caregiving need. And that said, and I mentioned this earlier, I do think that the book has things in it that will be of appeal to readers up and down the income scale, things like the details about how to optimize your Social Security, how to be smart about navigating Medicare, how to make a retirement plan, purpose in retirement, and aging in place, and the like. The core themes of my book are these. One is that social insurance is absolutely paramount. Social insurance means Social Security and Medicare. These are our two premier social insurance programs. The people I'm writing this book for, middle income people, absolutely need to understand and get the most out of these programs. It's going to be critical. Another big theme is that kind of complexity is the enemy. We've just built these incredibly complicated platforms and vehicles for retirement. And in fact, it's not a single system. It's a set of moving parts that don't necessarily integrate all that well. And another big theme of my book is that we shouldn't be blaming the victim here when we look at people who are not coming up to retirement, not well prepared. I think we tend to forget in this country about how difficult things have actually been in the last few decades. And we have short memories. I calculate here that in the book that somebody who was 55 years old in 2021 has lived through 4 recessions and a housing crash in 2009, 2010. Two of these recessions were especially calamitous. The Great Recession, where many people lost not only their jobs, but homes and their retirement savings. And then we had the COVID shutdown, where we took the economy and put it into a coma intentionally for a year. And I think the mindset tends to be all these things are in the past and now we're recovering. We've recovered. But the reality is that if you go through these calamities and experience this kind of damage, you don't really recover from it. The losses that you experience in income and assets are permanent, and they compound. Even though you may go back to work and start to resume saving and the like, the research tells us that those kinds of traumatic economic incidents really cause big problems. And then, of course, we just have had, until recently, really stagnant wage growth in the United States. Middle-class households are struggling to meet competing demands for the available dollar, whether that's affording a home, sending the kids to college, meeting healthcare expenses and the like, dealing with student debt, all these sorts of things have made it really tough to save for retirement. And when I talk to younger people, as I do, about where they should be putting their available dollars, I always say that I wouldn't necessarily put the first available dollar into retirement saving if, for example, you're carrying credit card balances or expensive student loan debt, or if you haven't been able to put away some liquid savings outside of retirement accounts that are available as a rainy day fund. Those things need to come first. The book is organized around, let's say, 6 kind of key levers that can be pulled to improve your retirement outcome if you're in this situation. And not all of them are going to be right for everybody, but I think many of them will. They're not gimmicks, and they're not necessarily all easy things to do, but there are things that are achievable and that I think are reasonable steps people can take to improve their outcomes. And the 6 are making a plan, because many people have not, timing your retirement, thinking carefully about how long you'll work, optimizing Social Security benefits, navigating Medicare, building savings, even late in the game it can be done, and leveraging home equity. So I'm going to talk a little, and let me also mention that there's some additional themes in the book outside the 6 kind of core levers that I talked about. One is managing your career late in the game. As Dory mentioned, I have a whole chapter about finding your purpose in retirement. I think staying engaged is terribly important. I deal with the whole question of aging in place and long-term care risk. A whole chapter about the value of advice and why it's worth considering hiring a financial planner if you hire the right type. And actually that chapter was excerpted in the Sunday New York Times And then I also have a whole chapter on defined benefit pensions, because even though I said earlier that they're disappearing in the private sector, there's still millions and millions of Americans who do have some level of defined benefit pension coming, either because they work in the public sector or in the private sector, even though most corporations have frozen their defined benefit pension plans. That doesn't mean those plans aren't still there and won't still be paying out a benefit to people. So there's a whole detailed chapter about how to navigate and manage a defined benefit pension. And then I close the book out with a 180 turn, because most of the book is very kind of practical, meat and potatoes advice. But I close it out with a policy chapter, really trying to make the case that we need in the United States to have a new era of social insurance, a renewed focus on Social Security and Medicare. I argue for the expansion of Social Security benefits, not cutting them, and reversing the tide of privatization that's been going on in Medicare. And by the way, on the expand Social Security point, I have a very detailed, in-depth essay issue of Newsweek that makes that case. You can find that online as well. The roadmap here, we don't have time to delve into all of these themes, but I want to focus on a few of the key ones. And then, of course, be happy to answer your questions on any of these topics. The first lever that I want to talk about is the importance of making a plan. The simple fact is that most people simply have not taken the time to do it. And if you haven't analyzed your finances and what your likely expenditures and income look like in retirement, you're really flying blind as you try to make decisions about this. And there are a lot of ways to make a plan. You can certainly do it yourself. There are a number of good software and online tools available today that can help with this. The other option is to hire a financial planner. And the chapter on hiring a planner gets into a great deal of guidance on what type of planner to hire. And that is terribly important, because there's a lot of people out there that call themselves financial planners, but they're not all fiduciary advisors, meaning that they have a legal obligation to put your interests first. How are people mostly doing this now? And this is from a survey that showed that basically when you ask how do people make retirement planning decisions, the vast majority just say, I'm just trusting my instincts. Far fewer numbers are working with advisors and the like. So lots of people are just doing it by the seat of their pants. What constitutes a successful plan? It's, as we discussed, it's replacing pre-retirement income. It is the possibility of having money available for fun or discretionary expenses in retirement. It's being able to make lifestyle choices, and it's having options for a rainy day or emergencies that inevitably do occur. For example, a large healthcare expenditure. The data on spending in retirement tell us that there often are these kind of big surges in spending towards the end of life for a long-term care need. And as I mentioned, the rule of thumb on the amount of income to replace is really pretty general, and spending does not tend to move in a straight line in retirement. The research tells us that it actually can vary from anywhere from as low as 54% to greater than 80%, depending, and it really does change over the course of retirement. The main point is this green bar is in the middle with the arrow next to it, is showing you how healthcare expenses can take over at later ages. Most of these categories tend to hold steady over the course of retirement, but healthcare is the exception. It can be a kind of a wild card factor in terms of your spending pattern in retirement. Having a plan is not something that's about precision or certainty. Too many things can change along the way. But it does give us kind of a context for decision making and a way to think about and understand what the possible risks that can come along. And people don't necessarily really understand properly what are the risks in retirement. And there's been some interesting research done on this, comparing what are the clearly quantifiable risks people face in retirement from a financial standpoint versus what people perceive those risks to be. I'll just ask the attendees on the call to just answer this question for yourself, maybe jot down your answer. Well, what would you say is the most significant of these risks in your retirement plan? Is it healthcare costs? Would you say it's stock market risk? Would you say it's longevity risk? In other words, the risk of outliving your savings or your resources? Do you think it's inflation? Or would you think that it's a family, and that one basically means having your time and resources diverted to provide care for a loved one, becoming a caregiver unexpectedly. So give that little thought for a second and jot down or just think for yourself what you would pick. And now I'm going to do in a second to reveal of what is, in fact, the quantifiable risk. Okay, I hope everybody's ready. In the study, most people thought stock market risk was the greatest risk, but it's actually longevity risk. That means the risk of exhausting your resources. Average lifespans have risen about 10% since 2000. For men, they average a little over 86 years. For women, nearly 89. And those are just averages, and we know that many people will beat those averages. In fact, a 65-year-old male has a nearly 30% chance of making it to 90, depending on their general health. And for women, the odds of making it to 90 are higher, anywhere from 30 to 40%. And so if you think about it from a married couple standpoint, it's a pretty good chance that one spouse will live to quite an advanced age. And so the issue here is just to understand, really speaks to the importance, frankly, of Social Security, and we'll get to Social Security in a minute, because it's when you think about how do I stretch savings through my retirement, there's an important number we don't know the answer to that needs to go into that calculation, namely, how long will I live? I don't know the answer for myself. You don't know the answer for yourself. Nobody knows the answer. This is the great fallacy in the shift to our defined contribution 401k/IRA approach to providing resources in retirement, as opposed to guaranteed income sources like pensions or Social Security. At any rate, having a plan, it's not a crystal ball, but it does eliminate some guesswork, and it provides a context for making some of these key decisions. And it can give you an idea of your odds of success and changes you can still make if you're not retired yet. Those might include, should I work longer? Should I make adjustments to my spending, or how much I need to spend in retirement? And especially with the help of a planner or an online software tool, it's possible to stress test your plan. I personally, my wife and I have been working with a financial planner really ever since I wrote my first book. And a quick funny story is that the editor of that book, The Hard Times Guide, said to me, you've got to have a chapter in there about how to hire a financial planner. And I was initially a little not terribly receptive to the idea for reasons that honestly I don't even remember, but I agreed to do it. I was relatively new covering this beat at the time as a reporter. Did the chapter, and I finished it and said to my wife, gosh, I think we need one of these people. We actually did hire a registered investment advisor who we've been working with ever since. And when you work with one of these folks, you can pose questions to the plan. Well, what happens if I retire at this age or that age? And with a flip of the switch, they can tell you. You can say, what happens if I need 2 years of long-term care in my 80s? And they can run the model and tell you what kind of shape you're in for that. Do you have adequate resources, savings to pay for that? How would you go about doing it? So there's lots of things that are extremely valuable about having a written or online plan, because you can do these what-ifs. And I think the good news about getting professional advice is that in the last couple of decades, it's really been democratized. It used to be that we thought about this as wealth management. It was something that was really available only to the very affluent. But a small d democratization has happened with all these do-it-yourself options, software options, fee-only planners, I want to emphasize, not fee-based, which is a mixture of commission and fee, but fee-only planners. You can hire on an hourly basis. You can hire a planner to just do a one-time plan for you, or just do a quarterly update. If it can be done less expensively in the past, rather than somebody who's going to be taking a big chunk out of your portfolio every quarter based on a percentage of your assets. Reasons that I like the notion of professional help. I think when we're in the accumulation phase of retirement, meaning when we're in our working years and saving for retirement, things can be pretty straightforward. I'm a big believer in simple, low-cost, passive investing in mutual funds. Just be invested broadly in the market. And it can be, you set the amount you're going to contribute, you rebalance your portfolio, perhaps quarterly, and you just keep driving away at that. But when you get close to retirement, and when you transition to retirement, and when you're in retirement, things are a little more complicated for a variety of reasons that I get into in the book. We have more complex financial decisions to make as we age, and as we make these transitions. the whole business of managing the drawdown of your savings can get complicated and can be greatly aided with some professional help. A really important reason, I think, is to protect yourself financially against cognitive decline risk. We know from the research that we all lose a beat as we age. And the kind of insidious thing about this is that as we experience cognitive decline, the research also tells us that we tend to think more highly of our abilities to make financial decisions, not less. So having somebody, a third party who is providing a check there is important. For married couples, if there's one spouse that is managing the household finances a lot, if that person is the first to pass away, I think an advisor on the scene can be so helpful for the surviving spouse as he or she transitions. But as I mentioned, you do need to step carefully as you think about hiring an advisor. You really want a fiduciary advisor, somebody who can answer the question, yes, I am a fiduciary at all times when I do my work for you. It means that they're legally obligated to put your interests first, not commissions they're earning or what are the sales objectives of the company they're working for in any given quarter. And again, the chapter of the book that deals with this gets into it in quite a bit of detail. And at the end of the day, success or failure is just, it's not running out of money before you die, simply put. Let's spend a little bit of time on the second lever, which is timing of retirement. One of the things I think is not well understood is just how incredibly sensitive a retirement plan is to when you retire, how long you work or don't. For a few reasons, this is true. One is, if you think about it, the length of time you work determines the total number of years of retirement that you're going to finance, more or fewer. And a longer number of years, of course, is more, quote unquote, expensive. More years of work means that you can contribute more to retirement accounts, retirement savings accounts. And the longer you're working, up to a point anyway, wage income can fund a delayed Social Security claim. So if you're still working in your mid-60s, you're hoping to delay Social Security claiming, you still need income to live on. And so wage income is an excellent way to do that. Now, having said all that, now I have a whole chapter in the book about timing retirement with some illustrations of how it can impact the retirement outcomes. But having said all that, timing your retirement can be outside your control. I hear people say often, I'll never retire. Many people do retire earlier than they thought they would. Roughly half of people wind up leaving the job earlier than planned, either due to a job layoff or a health problem where they need to go become a caregiver. That's an important caveat. And retirement, I think, also doesn't have to be a black and white on and off decision. Oftentimes people might retire from the full-time job they were doing, but maybe they do a bridge job or a part-time job or gig work, or they launch a business of some kind. Also importantly, for married couples, very often don't retire at the same time. Maybe one retires for one reason or another, but the other continues to work. And that can be very helpful. It can help insulate you from post-retirement financial shocks and can also be very helpful in funding a delayed Social Security claim. And I also want to say that this whole question of when to retire is really it's a highly personal decision. As we age, time becomes a more limited commodity, and deciding how we want to use it is about much more than just money. But so I am, though, trying in the book to just present this as one of the levers, and working even a few more years beyond what you planned can be hugely beneficial to improving retirement outcomes. The next lever I want to talk about is optimizing Social Security. For most of us, it's going to be the only guaranteed source of income, which is so important when we think about longevity risk. It's going to be there no matter how long we live. It is inflation adjusted annually, which is incredibly valuable and unique. You really can't buy this kind of inflation protection anywhere else. It is what I think of Social Security as longevity insurance, and that's a concept that's less well understood. I often hear from more affluent people planning for retirement to say, I don't really need to worry about Social Security. I've got plenty of money saved. And I just tell them to go back and run their plans without Social Security in them. And when they do that, they're going to watch their plans collapse. Even for more affluent households, Social Security is terribly important. Oftentimes, for people who do reach these very advanced ages, savings can be exhausted and Social Security remains, and it's been inflation adjusted along the way. just a word about how Social Security benefits are calculated, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand this. I think many people assume that you're paying your payroll taxes as you work, the FICA tax, and that somehow the amount that you contribute to the tax is what determines your benefit, but that's not right. Again, Social Security is designed to replace a certain amount of pre-retirement income. That's how it's geared. And the benefit amount is determined by your wage history, not your payroll taxes. Your payroll taxes, think of that as an insurance premium you're paying, but it is, and you have to pay into the system for a minimum of 10 years. But beyond that, your benefits can be determined by your wage history. Social Security takes your 35 highest years of income, and then each of those years is indexed up to current wage levels using a national wage index. What I mean by that is, so when I was back in my 20s, many years ago, let's say I started out at an entry-level job that paid, I don't know, probably $25,000 back in the late 70s. That same entry-level job today, let's say, pays $60,000 or $70,000. Social Security would take that job I had in my 20s and adjust that wage to reflect what it would pay in today's economy. So that those 35 highest years that are indexed are then converted into what's called the primary insurance amount. And you see this number if you download your Social Security benefit statement, which I hope you do. It'll show this primary insurance amount. And that is the benefit you've earned at your full retirement age, which is for most of us these days, it's 66 in a few months. So that is the number that you're working against. And you can make a decision to claim your benefit as early as 62 or as late as 70. And when you file before your full retirement age, you will experience early claiming reductions. You receive less monthly than you would later. And if you file after your full retirement age, you receive what are called delayed retirement credits. Claiming at the FRA is 33% more valuable than claiming at 62. Claiming at 7, and when I say that percentage, I'm talking about monthly income or annual, if you like. We're not talking about your lifetime amount, because we don't know that number because we don't know how long you'll live. But from a current income standpoint, claiming at FRA is 33% more valuable than claiming at 62. Claiming at age 70 is 76% more valuable than claiming at 62. I'll repeat that, 76% more valuable. So when we think about how do we goose our monthly income, these delays are profoundly important. Now, having said that, there's no free lunch here, because delay means funding your living expenses some other way while you wait. As I said before, that could come from wage income. It could come from savings. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that drawing down savings to fund a delay actually can be a good strategy. But the evidence tells us that people are starting finally to get this message, because people like me have been repeating it ad nauseum for years, and financial planners as well. We are seeing that claiming ages are rising a bit. Fewer people are claiming at 62 than they used to, but most people have claimed by their full retirement age, which is, again, 66 or so. Very small percentage claim, let's say, at 68, 69, and 70. A basic message here is that most people should be waiting longer. Now, there are reasons to claim early, if you're in poor health, let's say, or you absolutely need the income. But delay is generally better than claiming early, especially for married couples where one spouse typically is going to beat the mortality averages, and sometimes substantially. And over the course of a typical retirement that might be 25 years or so, the lifetime income difference can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when I say delay, I don't necessarily mean delay till 70, although that's great if you can do it. Delaying to 67, 68, every additional year you can delay is going to be important and very valuable. I want to talk briefly about Medicare and how to navigate Medicare. Also terribly important as a cornerstone of the book and of most people retirement planning. I would say that Medicare is, it's more complicated actually than Social Security. Healthcare costs are such an important part of retirement spending. They've generally been rising more quickly than in general inflation, although not lately. And your health is just a critical component of well-being in retirement. So this is not just about the dollars and cents. And I'll just want to leave you with two key, if I just don't remember anything else that I said about Medicare, I'm going to talk about two important points. One is you got to make careful choices at the point of initial enrollment in Medicare. And one of those choices in particular might be irrevocable. And secondly, enroll at the right time in order to avoid paying more for Medicare, potentially a lot more. A word about initial enrollment. The biggest decision you need to make at that point is choosing between traditional Medicare and Medicare Advantage. And a choice of Medicare Advantage might be irrevocable. What am I talking about here? There's really two paths available to you when you first enroll. One is traditional Medicare, which is fee-for-service Medicare, where you're likely going to be adding supplemental coverage and probably a Medigap. And you'll probably also be adding a prescription drug plan, also known as the Part D plans. The other option is Medicare Advantage, which is a commercially offered alternative insurance program. It wraps everything, all the different parts of Medicare into one. And those are managed care programs, typically at either an HMO or maybe a PPO. And Advantage has been growing very quickly. It's about half of all Medicare enrollment now and heading higher. The reasons I think for that are, one is they're lower upfront costs in terms of premiums. It's the convenience of the all-in-one feature. And Medicare Advantage plans like to tout various extra benefits that they offer, such as some level of dental insurance, for example, or maybe a gym membership. And I really have a contrarian view on this, contrarian in the sense that the market is headed in one way and I'm headed in the other. I really urge people to think carefully about before they sign up for Medicare Advantage. I think traditional Medicare is really the gold standard of health insurance in the United States. And if you can handle the higher premium costs up front, do it. When you're in traditional Medicare, you can access nearly any healthcare provider in the United States. You're going to have greater predictability in your total out-of-pocket costs over time, and I think total lower costs over time. And there have been a number of problems that have surfaced with Medicare Advantage that I've been writing about, others have been writing about. One is some of the problems really stem from the fact that it's managed care. So you run across a lot of the kind of paperwork and bureaucracy of typical commercial HMOs and PPOs. You need a procedure, a certain type of care, the insurance plan turns it down. They deny the care. They require these so-called prior authorizations, which is just a way of running you through the paperwork mill and delaying or denying care. And by definition, they have what are called narrow networks. In order to take advantage of the economics of these plans, you need to see in-network providers, which may be okay when you're relatively younger and healthier, but as we get older and most of it do develop, unfortunately, more serious healthcare needs, you may find yourself in a situation where the doctor or the hospital you want to use for a specific illness might be out of network, and that might be a big problem. And I think that people often don't understand is that picking Advantage at the point of initial enrollment can be an irrevocable decision. So traditional Medicare doesn't come with built-in out-of-pocket caps, which means you can be on the hook for higher costs in any given year unless you have a Medigap supplemental policy. So if you're going to be in traditional Medicare, you need a Medigap unless you get supplemental coverage some other way. Some people get it as a retiree benefit from an employer, or some get it from Medicaid. But here's the thing that a lot of people miss. You're only guaranteed access to a Medigap when you initially enroll in Medicare. There's a guaranteed issue window that is 6 months that begins on the first day of the month in which you are 65 and older and enrolled in Medicare Part B. And if you miss that window, you may not be able to get a Medigap. Let's say you pick Medicare Advantage at the point of initial enrollment and 2 years later you're dissatisfied and you want to go back into traditional Medicare. You can do that during the fall annual enrollment period, but the question is, will you be able to get a Medigap provider to sell you a policy? And they may or may not do it. So that's why I urge people to think carefully about this at the point of initial enrollment. Now, how do these premium costs stack up? So in traditional Medicare this year, of course, you'll be in Part A, which is hospitalization. There's no premium for that. Nobody pays a premium for Part A. Part B amounts to just under $2,000 a year. On Medigap, the prices are going to vary, but it might be another couple thousand. Part D is probably, on average, is going to be $400 to $500 a year. With Advantage, you would probably pay only for Part D, so the differential on premiums for traditional Medicare is about $2,600. But once you have that, you would be paying very little additional in copays or deductibles. When you're in Advantage, the Advantage plans come with a built-in cap on annual out-of-pocket, but they typically are about $5,000 a year. So you could be on the hook in any given year for that kind of out-of-pocket. So having said all that, this is not just a question about the dollars. Access to good health care is essential in retirement. And I urge people to, at this initial point of enrollment, typically at age 65, this is a 65-year-old self needs to think about the 80-year-old self and think ahead. It's a long-term decision, and it needs to be thought through carefully. And just on a personal note, I signed up for Medicare myself in 2022 for traditional Medicare, and I could not be happier with it. I'm going to talk really briefly about a couple other levers that I discuss in the book. One is home equity. Most older Americans own their own home, and home equity might be their largest source of saving. It's a more complicated kind of asset to tap since it involves highly personal lifestyle choices, things about whether you're staying in your community, staying in your home. But I do have a detailed chapter that outlines ways to extract home equity, including moving and downsizing. You can do that by not moving too far away, or you can move and downsize to a different location where costs might be lower. But the question is, can you extract home equity and either invest or live on that? I also, in that chapter, have a discussion about reverse mortgages, which is not my favorite product. It's actually not the favorite product of the public either. It's a product that's been declining for many years, but it's an option that can be used safely. It's a very complicated product, but it's an option for people who need to tap into their home equity and really don't want to move for one reason or another. So I do explain in the book how it can be used safely if you need and want to navigate that. And I said, as I mentioned, I wrap up the book with a chapter on social insurance and why I really feel that one of the reasons we're experiencing problems with retirement security in the United States is we've shifted risk from institutions to individuals, and that I think renewing our focus on kind of this pooled approach of social insurance would be important. Oftentimes I hear from readers who are worried about the future of Social Security or Medicare who will ask me things like, what are they going to do to my Social Security or my Medicare? And one of my responses is, it's not just about what they, the politicians, do. It's about what we, as the voters and the citizens of the country, want. And I think it's important to take an active voice and pay careful attention to what elected officials are saying. The next few years, I think, are going to present some important, potentially perilous choices on the future of Social Security and Medicare, and I think people could be paying attention to that. I want to wrap up so we can get to some questions. I just wanted to mention briefly that in addition to the book, which I, of course, hope you'll all read, I've been doing a podcast series on some of the key themes of the book. You can click on to sign up for my newsletter, which is free, and you can access the podcast series there. You can also find my podcast on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you search for Retirement Revised. You can find the newsletter at retirementrevise.substack.com, and I'm sure Dory will be happy to send anybody further information on that. You can get more information about the book on this page. I show another QR code you can click, takes you to my website. There's a whole page there about the book, including the reviews, the coverage, table of contents, if you want to know more about what's in there. And that website is retirementrevise.com. Probably enough of me talking at you. Dory, I'll stop right there. We can have a conversation and take questions.
I have to say this has just been so amazing and informative, and I have a little overwhelming. I'm just writing down all these things here.
Well, I say complexity is the enemy.
But it's so important, and as I mentioned at the beginning, I really recommend Mark's book. I've been able to go through it, and it really is helpful. So let me start. So you've answered some of the questions that like Mafa from New York had asked about situations where elders need to take Social Security early, and basically you did say sometimes people have to, no other income.
It's a highly personal decision. I never want people to think that everybody must wait. I don't think that.
Karen from Washington, D.C. asked, she says, the looming debt ceiling and default crisis this year is deeply worrying. What is your advice about mitigating risks of losses for those of us who don't have decades to recover from sharp losses?
Are we talking, I assume we're talking here about the possible impact on Social Security? When we say losses, the thing that, I'll just say what's the thing that's concerning me. Go ahead. You want to clarify?
Yeah, no, she doesn't clarify. So why don't you just go with what?
The thing that's worrying me about the looming debt ceiling fight is that the GOP seems to want to hold Social Security and Medicare hostage to lifting the debt ceiling, meaning forcing a discussion about a cut in benefits. And that could happen through any number of mechanisms. One is, I always say, be careful of bipartisan closed-door commissions. One of the proposals is to create these behind the closed doors committees of lawmakers to come up with plans for addressing Social Security solvency. Then they hand down the tablets for an up and down vote. That is not the way this should be done. There should be an open public debate. Lawmakers need to have their names associated with their votes. Voters need to ask elected officials about how they would make changes to these programs. So I get into that in detail in the book, but that's the thing that's concerning me about it. Now, of course, if we breach the debt ceiling, and I guess we've already technically breached it, we've reached the exhaustion point, but there are all kinds of economic risks associated with it come a little later down the road that I'm not a big expert on and don't want to speculate about. But I do worry about whether Social Security and Medicare could become sort of sacrificial lambs here.
Thanks. And Karen did write and clarify. She said that her actual question is about the likelihood of stock market volatility and losses triggered by the debt ceiling and default crisis.
That risk is there.
And
I don't know what else to say about it.
Yeah. Any thoughts on how to mitigate it?
Elect sane politicians.
Yeah,
I don't mean to sound glib about this.
No, it's absolutely true.
First of all, I'm not an expert on the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
This shouldn't even be an issue. The dollars that have been borrowed to fund the government is putting something in your credit card and then just deciding not to pay for it. It's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thomas of Bolton asks, if I work after 70, will I be required to make contributions to Social Security, and would my benefit go up?
So the benefit, the delayed retirement credits stop at 70. So once you reach 70, there's absolutely no reason not to claim a benefit. And yes, you would continue to pay payroll taxes into the system at that point.
But your benefits would go up after.
If you're working.
Yeah, if you're working.
That's a complicated answer to that. Again, I mentioned that it's based on your highest 35 years. So if you're working at 71 or 2, let's say, and you're adding additional high years, Social Security will recalculate your benefit amount annually to reflect that, but it won't have a huge increase on the benefit amount just because of the way the math works on the averaging of the high 35 years. But the big takeaway here is nobody has a reason to delay taking their benefit past 70. You're foregoing valuable income.
Okay. So maybe it would be helpful if you mention if people took Social Security at 62 versus full retirement age, and you already commented on the 70, but I know, but I don't know all the specifics, that if you take it early, then if you end up earning more money, you might have to pay some back, but if you reach full retirement age, you can earn. Can you speak to that? Because I don't want to be wrong on that. Is that accurate, that the age that you take it may impact how much you can earn after you've begun Social Security?
Oh, okay. So there's something called the retirement earnings test, which if you're receiving benefits and also working and you're below your full retirement age, half of your benefit amount is withheld by Social Security until you reach FRA, full retirement age. But what's misunderstood often about this is those dollars are not permanently lost. They will be paid back to you after you reach your FRA. They're funneled back into your benefit.
Oh, well, that's
so it's a peculiar feature of Social Security.
Yeah. What about the benefit?
Spousal benefit is
yes.
The spousal benefit is equal to half of the other spouse's benefits, and so that's always an option that's there. You can file for a spousal benefit. What's changed in the last 7-8 years is that it used to be possible to file for a spousal benefit on a spouse who was not yet receiving Social Security. It was this file and suspend strategy. That was phased out. And so you can only file for a spousal benefit if the spouse is receiving a benefit. The one interesting exception to that rule is if you're divorced. A lot of people, and I get into this a little bit in the book, it is possible to file for a spousal benefit from a former spouse under certain conditions. And you can do that irrespective of whether that spouse is on benefit or not. Again, I detail how that works in my Social Security chapter.
Yeah, I think Social Security and Medicare are such important things, and I know you really stress that a lot in your book.
Yeah.
I have actually a question about Medicare, and I know a number of people who've asked me, and I don't have a good answer for it, so I'm going to ask you. So what if, I know everybody at 65 has to at least apply and be part of Medicare, but many people, if they or their spouse are still working, might have other coverage. They don't need to take the Medicare B or need the drug thing or whatever. What are the stipulations? Say somebody stops, say you've been covered by, so in my case, I'm covered by my husband's plan because he still works a day a week, even though he's 90 now. And he works enough, however, to qualify, whatever, because he works and teaches and does all this stuff. When he stops working and no longer gets that benefit, can you end up applying at any time, or do you have to wait then until the open enrollment?
Okay, that's Medicare? A great question. This is another really important Medicare topic, which I deal with in that chapter. So here's the way. So everybody needs to sign up at 65 with one important exception, and that exception is if you are still covered through active employment. You're still working and you receive health insurance through your employer or your spouse, like your situation, Dory. And in those situations, you can delay past age 65. But the important word here is active. So let's say somebody is laid off at 64 and is receiving COBRA insurance. They might think, oh, I still have my employer's insurance, therefore I can delay Medicare, but that's incorrect. You need to sign up at 65 in that situation. So it's the word active is the thing to take away on that. Now, why is this so important? If you miss your correct enrollment period, 65 is the age, unless, again, you're still receiving employer insurance, then you start racking up these late enrollment penalties. And the one on Part B is the most important to understand. For every 12 months that you are late on your enrollment, you're going to pay a 10% penalty on Part B for the rest of your life. 24 months late, 20% penalty, so on and so forth. This can become quite a large amount, and nobody needs to be paying 20% more for Medicare Part B than they need to. You got to really watch this carefully. Now, you mentioned that everybody needs to at least sign up at 65, and that's not really, I know a lot of people think that at 65 you must sign up for Part A because there's no premium with Part A, and you really don't have to do that if you're still covered by an employer. You can do it because it's free, but it's in my view, a belt and suspenders approach, because if you have good insurance from your employer, that's going to cover your hospitalization. But let's just say it can't hurt to sign up for Part A. The way that when you ultimately do sign up for Medicare, let's say you've been actively employed, and I'm just going to, for example, now you're 60. Like I signed up when I was 68 because I was on my wife's plan through her work, because I'm an independent contractor. I didn't have my own insurance. Right. So when I signed up, what I had to do, there's a form, and I discuss this in the chapter, that you have to submit with your application. It's a Medicare form that your employer has to sign, verifying that you, in fact, were covered through employment up to that point. So I verified that I'd been covered up to age 68 through my wife's active employment. And that's what exempted me from the late enrollment penalties, not whether I'm enrolled in Part A at 65 or not. So these late enrollment penalties are an important thing to pay attention to and to navigate properly.
Very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to go back and reread that chapter more carefully. I think you've actually covered a lot of the questions I wanted to ask, but let's you've covered questions that people were raising. So let's see. Yeah, maybe talk a tiny bit more, if you would, about why purpose is so important, even if you have financial issues and stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I just think social engagement is so important. I think, Dory, a lot of the discussion about purpose in retirement started a couple of decades ago with the work that Mark Friedman at Encore.org and others at Encore were doing. And I think in the initial years of that movement, a lot of it was very much focused on social engagement and social purpose, socially responsible enterprise, but let's say more C-suite level, former chief executives who are off starting a nonprofit, that sort of thing. But the notion of finding a reason to stay engaged with the world in retirement, whatever it is that you're passionate about, I'm sure you've discussed this many times on these calls. It's so important to health, psychological well-being, and a feeling of engagement with the world. I have a whole chapter that tries to focus on ways that you can do this, and the examples I give are everyday people as opposed to former CEOs who gone out and started their own organization. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm trying to make the point here that this is something that is available to all of us.
Yeah, great. And what do you think is the most common mistake that people make when they're planning or thinking about retirement?
It's a hard question to answer, but I think one way to look at it is, I think probably the most common mistake is failing to make a plan. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the evidence is pretty clear that most of us are winging it. Take the time to make the plan because that's in motion a lot of these other things we're talking about, like thinking through retirement timing or Social Security claiming, for example.
Mm-hmm. Great. So what's next for you? Do you have any plans for retirement or to keep on writing or what?
I'll be 69 at the end of this year. And one of the nice things about my work is that I don't really have a black and white on and off switch because I'm an independent writer. I work, as you mentioned, for a number of different outlets. And I'm involved in a number of other projects and issues outside of. But I anticipate continuing to write about retirement for a while yet. I may adjust the mix and the quantity that I'm doing. And I've been in the fortunate position of being able to just adjust that mix between, especially as I get to the point where I'll claim Social Security at 70 and replace some of my income. I'll probably start taking my foot off the gas just a little bit on the retirement writing, but no plans to become less active overall.
It is interesting how there are some careers that lend itself so much. I consider my work also a portfolio, and I'm in it's hard to say now, but my latter 70s. Not hard to say, it's just that I'm going from mid-70s to more latter 70s now. So it's like a different life stage, but working for some of us, when you've got that flexibility and being able to do more or little is such a gift. It really is. So.
Yeah, it makes the decisions easier. I think the other thing that I've observed just in talking with friends who are now at this age of making these transitions is that I think people who have these sort of full-time occupations where work is so front and center and occupies so much of their kind of mental energy that if they haven't spent any time really thinking about what's next or developing outside interests, it can be so difficult. It's just like hitting that brick wall. What am I going to do with myself? And I think you just don't want to get to that point. So back to this question of purpose in retirement, I discuss in the book, develop some interest while you're still working and try some things out and know where you're going if you can, at least where you think you might want to go. You can still make changes along the way, but don't hit the point of retirement with sort of a blank slate. Have some outside interests and passions that are not defining you just by what you do 9 to 5.
Totally agree. And I think it's so important. It's that idea of thinking about what you're retiring to and what you're taking with you. And you don't have to wait until that moment. It's better. It's part of the plan, actually. Plan and the life plan. Yeah.
I started working independently more than 15 years ago outside of full-time employment, and it's just been such a blessing.
Yeah.
Having control of your own destiny and understanding that entire life is not just determined by what you do.
Yeah.
I think it's so easy to see things that way when you work in full-time jobs.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that seems like a really good takeaway. But I want to give you the last word. Any other thing you'd like to add? I want to put one word in before your last word, which is the book is called Retirement Reboot, Commonsense Financial Strategies for Getting Back on Track by Mark Miller, and I recommend it. And he's given you already his website, retirementrevise.com. But final takeaways that you might want to
No, just really appreciate the time to talk about the key themes of the book. And if folks on the call are interested more to learn more, do check out the newsletter or the podcast and or both. It's always great to talk with you. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for being here, and thank everybody who's been listening. So thank you so much, and stay well and safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.